I knew something was wrong before the lights dimmed, before the applause swelled, before the cameras angled toward the stage and the host lifted the microphone with that polished smile people practice in mirrors. I stood near the back of the venue, hands folded, watching my wife pace just behind the curtain like a general preparing for victory. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe the channel and let me know in the comments where are you watching from. It helps more than you know. The launch had been months in the making. Her brand, her name in gold lettering across a wall of white orchids and soft amber lighting. Every detail curated to suggest independence, power, and arrival. The kind of night meant to signal that a woman had stepped into her own. I was 63 years old, standing there in a dark suit I'd owned longer than some of the interns working the room, feeling like an accessory that no longer matched the outfit. People congratulated me as they passed. Investors, influencers, local press. They shook my hand, smiled politely, and moved on, eyes already drifting back toward her. She was radiant, confident. Not once did she look my way. That should have told me everything. We hadn't arrived together. She said it would be better for the optics if she made her entrance alone, that this night was about her journey, her voice, her story. I told myself that was fair. We had been married for more than 2 decades. I had funded the first sketches, the first samples, the early losses she never talked about on podcasts. I never needed credit. I believed in quiet support. The music shifted. The host announced her name. Applause rolled through the room like a wave. She walked onto the stage and the crowd leaned in. She thanked her team, her mentors, herself. She spoke about resilience, about shedding old versions of your life to become something truer. The words landed smoothly, practiced and confident. Then she said my name, just once, and only to say goodbye. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She smiled and framed it like empowerment. Told the audience that some chapters end not in failure but in clarity. That tonight marked not just the birth of a brand but the end of a marriage that no longer fit who she had become. Gasps rippled through the room. Phones rose instantly. I felt every eye turn toward me. She never looked back. For a moment I considered walking out, taking the quiet exit, letting the night belong to her the way she wanted. Instead, I stayed still. I remembered something my father once told me about public humiliation, that it only works if you accept the role you're handed. The applause was uncertain when she finished. Polite, confused. She stepped down from the stage and disappeared into a cluster of people congratulating her on her bravery. No one spoke to me. I walked to the bar, ordered water, and took out my phone. I didn't act in anger. I acted in preparation. Years earlier, after watching another business partnership implode over ego, I had insisted on financial safeguards, separate operating accounts, signature thresholds, temporary freezes that could be triggered remotely under specific circumstances. At the time, she laughed and said I was paranoid. I unlocked my phone and initiated the protocol. No drama, no announcements, just confirmation screens. Within minutes, the primary accounts tied to the brand were paused, not seized, not emptied, frozen, enough to stop movement without causing immediate panic. I put the phone away. The music swelled again. Champagne was poured. The room tried to pretend nothing unusual had happened. Then the sirens cut through the noise, not loud at first, just distant enough that people hesitated, wondering if they belonged to the city outside or the night inside. When the doors opened and uniformed officers stepped in, the room went silent. They didn't rush. They didn't shout. They asked for the event coordinator. My wife turned slowly, her smile faltering for the first time that evening. I watched from where I stood, hands steady, heart calm. Because when someone chooses to end things in public, they forget one important detail. Public spaces invite witnesses, and once witnesses are involved, control has a way of slipping faster than anyone expects. The officers didn't announce themselves the way television makes you expect. No raised voices, no hands on holsters, just calm, professional presence that immediately shifted the energy in the room. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Someone laughed nervously, then stopped when no one joined in. My wife's team clustered around her instinctively, as if proximity alone could shield her from whatever was unfolding. She leaned toward the event coordinator, whispering sharply. Her confidence hadn't vanished yet, but it had thinned. An officer asked for identification. Another requested access to the event's private office. Their tone was neutral, but the word financial carried farther than it should have in a room that quiet. I didn't move. I watched. This wasn't about spectacle anymore, it was about sequence. One of the officers glanced in my direction briefly, then looked away. He didn't approach me. That mattered. Whatever had triggered their arrival wasn't centered on me standing there with a glass of water and an audience full of cameras. People began speculating out loud. A fraud audit, a noise complaint, a licensing issue. Whispers spread faster than facts ever do, and I could feel the narrative slipping out of her control by the second. She finally spotted me. Our eyes met across the room. For the first time that night, there was no performance in her expression. Just calculation. A silent question formed on her lips. "What did you do?" I didn't answer it. An officer asked her to step aside. She complied, still smiling, still playing the role of gracious founder managing an inconvenience. The cameras followed until a security staffer asked the press to hold back. That was when her smile broke. She turned sharply, scanning the room again, this time with urgency. When she found me, she walked straight over, heels clicking too loudly on the marble floor. "What is this?" she hissed, stopping just short of arm's length. "An interruption," I said evenly. Her eyes narrowed. "Did you call them?" "No." That much was true. She exhaled, relief flashing across her face for half a second before suspicion crept back in. "Then why are they here?" I took a sip of water before answering. "You built a brand around independence. Visibility invites scrutiny." Her jaw tightened. "This is not the time for lectures." An officer approached us, clipboard in hand. He asked her again for identification and requested she accompany them to the private office. This time, the request carried weight. She looked at me once more. There was something almost pleading there now, layered beneath irritation. "I'll be right back," she said, as if we were still a united front. She followed them. The doors closed. The room erupted. Phones were out in full force now, texts flying, speculation hardening into rumor. Someone near the bar said they'd heard something about frozen accounts. Another mentioned an investor dispute. Each guess was worse than the last. I stayed where I was. A few minutes later, my phone vibrated, a notification confirming what I already knew. The freeze had propagated. Not just the brand accounts, the linked marketing disbursement, the vendor escrow, the short-term operating funds she'd planned to access after the event. Still untouched, still intact, just inaccessible. I slipped the phone back into my pocket as if nothing had happened. The event coordinator reappeared, pale and sweating, trying to reassure guests that everything was under control, that refreshments would continue, that the founder would return shortly. She didn't. Instead, one of the officers came out alone and spoke quietly to the coordinator, who nodded too quickly. The music never came back on. People began leaving in clusters, pretending they had early mornings or other commitments. The press lingered until security firmly but politely ushered them out. When my wife finally emerged, she looked smaller, not frightened, cornered. She walked toward me slowly this time. No entourage, no applause, no lights. Just the sound of heels on stone in a room that suddenly felt much larger than it had an hour earlier. Her voice dropped when she reached me. "They said there's a temporary hold on the accounts." "Yes," I said. She stared at me, disbelief giving way to anger. "You can't do that." "I can," I replied, and I did. Her mouth opened, then closed. She glanced around, realizing how many people were still watching, how little privacy she had left. "You humiliated me," she said quietly. I met her gaze. "You chose the stage." She shook her head, backing away as if the distance might change the outcome. "This isn't over." I didn't disagree, because what she didn't know yet was that the police weren't finished asking questions. And neither was I. She left the venue without saying goodbye. No statement, no apology to her team. Just a tight nod to the officers and a hurried exit through a side door meant for caterers and security, not founders wrapped in success stories. The crowd was already thinning by the time she disappeared into the night, but the damage had been done. Public exits linger longer than public entrances. I stayed behind long enough to watch the room reset itself, staff collecting glasses, decor crews peeling away the illusion piece by piece, gold lettering taken down, orchids discarded like they'd never meant anything. I walked out alone. The rain had started lightly, just enough to blur the streetlights and soften the reflections on the pavement. I didn't open my umbrella. I needed the cold clarity. At home, the house felt unfamiliar. Not empty, dislocated, like furniture had been moved without permission. I poured a drink I didn't finish and sat in the study, listening to the quiet hum of appliances working through the night. Around midnight, my phone rang. It was her. I let it ring. Then again. On the third call, I answered. Her voice was sharp at first, defensive. She accused me of sabotage, of jealousy, of trying to punish her for outgrowing me. The words tumbled out fast, practiced, as if she'd rehearsed them in the car. I waited until she ran out of breath. "This isn't about your brand," I said when she finally paused. "It's about transparency." She scoffed. "You froze my accounts. You embarrassed me in front of everyone. And you think you're the victim." "I didn't embarrass you," I replied. "I stopped movement." She laughed bitterly. "You sound like a banker." "I sound like someone who planned for volatility." That word hit her harder than I expected. She lowered her voice. "The police said it's temporary. That once things are clarified, the holds will be lifted." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe they won't." Silence. Then a softer tone. Calculated. "We can talk this through, privately." I leaned back in my chair and stared at the bookshelf where our framed photos used to sit. They were gone. She'd taken them weeks earlier, saying she needed them for a campaign shoot. "I've been quiet long enough," I said. "Talking didn't stop you from choosing a microphone over a conversation." She snapped back into anger. "I didn't choose the microphone, I chose myself." "That's fine," I said. "Just don't expect me to finance the exit." She hung up. The next morning I received 3 emails. One from her lawyer outlining how unreasonable my actions were. One from her chief financial officer requesting immediate access to the accounts to meet payroll. And one from a number I didn't recognize. It was a detective. He asked if I was available to answer a few questions about recent financial activity connected to the brand. I called him back within minutes. We spoke calmly. He asked about account controls, about signatures, about when and why the freeze had been initiated. I answered honestly, referencing dates, clauses, and safeguards that had been in place for years. He thanked me and said they'd be in touch. By noon, the story had started circulating online. Not in full. Not yet. Just fragments. Police presence at launch event. Brand accounts paused. Founder unavailable for comment. Speculation filled the gaps faster than truth ever could. Her team reached out again. Softer this time. Less accusatory. They asked if there was any way to restore limited access. Just enough to keep things afloat. I declined. Not out of spite. Out of necessity. You don't loosen a tourniquet until you know where the bleeding is coming from. That evening, as I sat watching the city lights come on one by one, I realized something unsettling. The police hadn't come because of me. They'd come because something else had already been moving beneath the surface. And freezing the accounts hadn't started the investigation. It had simply forced it into the open. The detectives came to the house 2 days later. Not in a rush. Not with flashing lights. Just a marked car easing to the curb like it belonged there. I watched from the study window as they stepped out, checked the address, and adjusted their jackets. Calm. Methodical. That told me this wasn't reactive, it was procedural. I opened the door before they knocked. They introduced themselves, showed credentials, and asked if we could talk somewhere quiet. I led them to the dining room. The long table still held the faint outline of a centerpiece we hadn't used since before the launch, before everything shifted. They didn't sit until I did. The questions were precise. When were the accounts established? Who had signing authority? What circumstances allowed for a freeze? I answered without embellishment, pulling documents I'd already organized into a folder I kept in the study. Preparation changes the tone of a conversation. They asked about recent transfers, about vendor payments scheduled immediately after the event, about a consulting agreement that had been amended twice in the last month. I raised an eyebrow at that one. Amended how? The detective slid a printed page across the table. The agreement included a rush clause, accelerated disbursement, fees that didn't align with industry standards. The recipient was a shell entity registered out of state with a mailing address that traced back to a shared workspace. I didn't need to say it out loud. They nodded as if confirming something they already suspected. When they left, they thanked me for my cooperation and reminded me not to discuss the visit. I closed the door and stood there for a moment, listening to the house settle. Then my phone buzzed. Her lawyer again. This time the tone had changed. They wanted a meeting, neutral location, no press, no statements. I agreed. We met at a private office downtown. Glass walls, frosted doors, a receptionist who didn't ask questions. She arrived with counsel and a brand consultant who looked like he'd slept in his car. She didn't sit right away. "You went to the police," she said. "I answered questions," I replied. "There's a difference." Her lawyer interjected, framing it as a misunderstanding, a timing issue, a matter of internal controls colliding with rapid growth. Words meant to blur edges. I waited until he finished. Then I slid a copy of the consulting agreement across the table. Her eyes flicked down, just once. "Enough. That isn't what it looks like," she said. "It rarely is," I replied. She leaned back, crossing her arms. Defensive posture, familiar. "You froze everything over a technicality." "No," I said calmly. "I froze it because money was moving faster than explanations." Her consultant cleared his throat. "If limited access were restored, we could stabilize public perception." Public perception. I looked at her. "You ended a marriage on a stage because perception mattered more than privacy. Now you want stability." Her lawyer shifted. "We can negotiate terms." "Of what?" I asked. "The truth." Silence settled in the room. She finally spoke, quieter now. "I didn't think you'd push this far." I met her eyes. "I didn't think you'd make it necessary." The meeting ended without resolution. No raised voices, no slammed doors. Just people standing up and realizing the floor had tilted beneath them. That night I received an email from the bank. A compliance notice. Formal language. Additional review initiated. Estimated timeline indeterminate. Translation. Nothing was moving anytime soon. Online, the story evolved. Still no full details, just questions. Why were the accounts frozen? Why had the founder canceled appearances? Why were authorities involved at a brand launch meant to celebrate independence? Her social media went quiet. Too quiet. I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because I felt victorious, because I felt aligned. The next morning, another call came in. Same detective. He asked if I was aware of any overseas accounts connected to the brand or to my wife personally. I said I wasn't. He thanked me and added, almost casually, that they'd identified discrepancies that predated the launch. That part lingered, because it meant the night she chose to end things publicly wasn't a beginning. It was a cover. And once you see that, you start to understand why some people choose stages over conversations. They're hoping the lights will keep the shadows from catching up. The overseas accounts changed everything. Not because they were large, they weren't, but because they existed at all. Quiet channels opened without announcement, routed through jurisdictions known more for discretion than transparency. Money that moved just far enough away to feel untouchable. The detective didn't accuse, he didn't need to. He simply asked if I had ever authorized international transfers tied to the brand or to any consulting entities. I hadn't. I told him that plainly. That afternoon, the banks escalated their reviews. Not just compliance checks now, but coordinated audits. Once that machinery starts turning, it doesn't stop because someone asks nicely. Her lawyer called again, then her consultant, then her brother. I didn't answer. At this point, words weren't useful. What mattered was sequence. The next public sign came when a scheduled interview was canceled without explanation. Then a pop-up store opening quietly disappeared from the calendar. Vendors began asking questions in emails that grew more cautious by the hour. Employees noticed too. When payroll didn't clear on time, reassurance stopped working. That evening, she showed up at the house unannounced. I opened the door and saw someone I barely recognized. Not the woman from the stage, not the polished founder, just someone tired and stripped of performance. "I need access," she said. No greeting, no preamble. "To what?" I asked. "Enough to keep things from collapsing," she replied. "You don't understand what's at stake." I stepped aside and let her in. Not because I agreed, but because conversations land differently indoors. She paced the living room, hands running through her hair. She spoke about employees, about reputations. about how one misstep could undo years of work. I let her talk. When she finally stopped, I asked one question. When were the overseas accounts opened? She froze. That pause told me more than any confession. You're destroying me, she said quietly. No, I replied. I stopped protecting you. Tears followed. Not dramatic. Exhausted. She said she never meant for it to go this far, that she was trying to secure independence, that the brand needed insulation from risk. You insulated yourself, I said, not the company. She sank onto the sofa, suddenly small. They said it was normal, that everyone does it. Everyone doesn't, I said. People who plan exits do. That was the moment she realized how much ground she'd lost. The knock on the door came just after 9. Firm, professional. When I opened it, the same officers stood there, this time with paperwork in hand. Not warrants, requests, formal ones. They asked her to come with them to answer additional questions. She looked at me once. No anger now, just resignation. I didn't think you'd let it get to this, she said. I met her gaze. You let it get there the moment you chose spectacle over honesty. They walked her out calmly. No cuffs, no neighbors watching, just the sound of footsteps fading into the night. I closed the door and stood alone in the quiet house. Later, the detective called to confirm what I already knew. The investigation was expanding. Accounts, entities, advisors. Nothing moved without leaving a trail. As I sat in the dark, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to consider until then. The launch wasn't the climax, it was the distraction. And the distraction only worked because she believed I'd stay silent. People mistake patience for ignorance. But patience, when paired with preparation, has a way of turning lights back on. Tomorrow would bring statements, lawyers, headlines. But tonight, for the first time since the launch, the truth was finally louder than the music had ever been. The statements came the next morning. Not from her. From the brand. Carefully worded language about temporary restructuring, a cooperation with authorities, and commitment to transparency. The kind of phrases designed to calm investors while answering nothing. It didn't work. By noon, the police confirmed an active investigation. No charges announced yet, but enough acknowledgement to shift the story from gossip to fact. Media outlets that had praised her launch only days earlier now led with cautionary headlines. She didn't call. Her lawyer did. He spoke more slowly this time, asked what it would take to resolve matters privately, suggested asset releases in exchange for cooperation, for discretion, for closure. I listened, then declined. Not because I wanted revenge, because the truth doesn't negotiate well with silence. The investigation moved quickly after that. Financial records were subpoenaed. Advisors distanced themselves. Consultants stopped returning calls. People who had cheered the loudest on launch night quietly rewrote their biographies. When she was released later that evening, she went straight to a hotel. Not the house, not the office. Somewhere neutral where no one would ask questions. We didn't speak again. The accounts remained frozen until the review concluded. By then, the structure of the brand had changed entirely. New oversight, new management, less spectacle, more accountability. I signed the final divorce papers a month later. No audience this time, no speeches, just signatures and a silence that felt earned. At 63, I wasn't starting over. I was continuing without noise. The house became calmer, mornings quieter. I returned to routines that had been buried beneath someone else's ambition. Long walks, unrushed meals, work that didn't require applause to feel valuable. Occasionally, someone would ask if I regretted how it ended. I told them regret requires wishing for a different truth. I didn't. She chose the stage. She chose the timing. She chose the exposure. All I did was refuse to disappear when the spotlight shifted. There's a lesson in that, if you look closely. Not about control, about boundaries, about understanding that support doesn't mean surrender and love doesn't mean erasing yourself to keep someone else shining. I never wanted her downfall, but I wasn't responsible for cushioning it either. The night of the launch will always exist online somewhere, clipped and replayed, stripped of context. People will argue about who was right and who was wrong. That doesn't matter to me. What matters is that when the music stopped and the lights came up, I was still standing in my own life. And if you've been listening this far, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching from. It helps more than you know.